The Colosseum still stands after nearly 2,000 years, a monument to Roman might, carved in stone, shadowed by memory. But this isn't a story of emperors or roaring crowds. Not tonight. This is the story of the quiet ones, the workers who shaped every stone, the prisoners who cleared the dust, the spectators who came to watch and stayed to forget. The Colosseum was built for spectacle, but beneath its arches are layers of silence, stories never told. And so tonight we slow things down.
No battles.
No drama, just the soft echoes of a fading empire and the lives it left behind. Prologue, the night before glory. The torchlight wavered against stone walls that wept with moisture, casting dancing shadows that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. Emperor Titus moved through the hypogeum's labyrinthine passages alone, his sandals echoing against the damp flagstones with each measured step. Above him, the great amphitheater slumbered like a colossal beast, its marble hide gleaming pale beneath the stars, waiting for tomorrow's blood to stain its pristine sands. The air hung thick with the acrid smoke of pitch-soaked torches and the musky stench of caged beasts. From the shadows came the deep, rumbling growls of lions and the restless pacing of tigers, their great paws scraping against iron bars. Chains clinked in the darkness, not the bonds of animals, but the shackles of men who would die come dawn. The gladiators huddled in their cells, some praying to forgotten gods, others sharpening blades that would taste Roman blood beneath Roman cheers. Titus paused before a cell where a Thracian warrior sat motionless, his scarred hands folded in his lap. The emperor's torch revealed eyes that held no fear, only a grim acceptance of fate. This man had built the very walls that would witness his death, had hauled the travertine blocks and mixed the mortar with his own sweat and tears. Now he would bleed upon the sand for the entertainment of those who had enslaved him. The Colosseum breathed around them all, emperor, gladiator, beast, and keeper alike. Its massive stone lungs inhaled the suffering of those who had died in its construction, exhaled the promise of glories yet to come. Every arch had been mortared with ambition, every pillar raised upon the bones of the conquered. The amphitheater was Rome itself made manifest, magnificent and terrible, eternal and merciless. In the flickering torchlight, Titus could almost see the ghosts of all who would perish within these walls. The slaves who had quarried its stones beneath the whip's bite, the gladiators who would fall with sand in their teeth and crowds roar in their ears, the criminals who would be torn apart by wild beasts while senators applauded and children laughed, the emperors who would one day be forgotten, their names carved in stone but their deeds dissolved in blood. Yet the people would come. Tomorrow they would pour through the gates like water through a broken dam, their voices rising in a thunder that would shake the 7 hills. They would demand spectacle, demand death, demand the intoxicating illusion that Rome's power was absolute and eternal. And the Colosseum would feed them, gorging itself on their bloodlust until they stumbled home, sated and empty. The emperor's torch guttered, casting his shadow long against the wall. In the dancing light, he seemed no longer a man but a specter, a harbinger of the countless souls who would find their fate within these corridors. The stones themselves seemed to pulse with a heartbeat both ancient and eternal, as if the amphitheater had always existed and always would, outlasting the empire that birthed it, outlasting the gods who blessed it, outlasting the very men who bled for it. As Titus turned to ascend the narrow stairs that would carry him back to his palace, his final torch illuminated carved initials in the stone, MLA, etched with precise architect's precision. Marcus Livius Aquila had signed his masterpiece, this monument to glory and damnation that would define his legacy forever. The man who had dreamed these underground chambers into existence, who had calculated every angle of suffering and every measure of magnificence, awaited tomorrow's dawn with pride and dread warring in his breast. Chapter 1: The Architect's Dream. Marcus Livius Aquila traced his fingers along the worn parchment, its surface bearing the intricate drawings that had consumed his nights for months. The hypogeum's labyrinthine passages sprawled across the papyrus like the veins of some great beast, each corridor calculated to channel men and animals toward their appointed deaths. In the flickering oil lamp light of his modest workshop, the architect studied the lines he had drawn with such precision, wondering if future generations would remember the name carved discreetly into the stone foundations. The morning sun filtered through the narrow window, casting geometric shadows across his drafting table. Marcus had risen before dawn, as was his custom, to review the plans one final time before presenting them to the imperial engineers. 5 years had passed since Emperor Vespasian had first spoken of his grand amphitheater, and now the foundations were nearly complete. The hypogeum, his hypogeum, would soon house the elaborate machinery that would lift wild beasts and condemned criminals into the arena above. He had not been born to this destiny. His father, Lucius Aquila, had been a stonemason from the hill town of Tibur, a man whose hands bore the permanent stain of mortar and whose back was bent from decades of cutting travertine blocks. But Marcus had shown an aptitude for numbers and spatial reasoning that transcended his humble origins. A provincial magistrate had noticed the boy's talent for sketching buildings and had arranged for him to study under a master architect in Rome. The sound of bare feet on stone interrupted his reverie. His wife, Claudia, appeared in the doorway carrying a clay cup of warmed wine mixed with honey, his morning ritual before facing the chaos of the construction site. "You've been awake since the 4th hour," she said, settling the cup beside his drawings. Her dark hair was still unbound, falling in waves around her shoulders. "Even the gods rest, husband." Marcus smiled, reaching for her hand. "The gods do not have Emperor Vespasian breathing down their necks." He pulled her closer, inhaling the scent of olive oil and rose water from her skin. "Where is our little sparrow?" "Gaius is still sleeping, though he'll wake soon demanding stories of gladiators and lions." Claudia's expression grew serious. "He asks when his father will have time to take him to the forum again." The weight of her unspoken reproach settled on Marcus's shoulders. Since receiving the commission for the great amphitheater, he had become a stranger to his own household. His son, barely 7 years old, knew more about the construction schedule than about his father's dreams and fears. "When this is finished," Marcus said, the words falling hollow even to his own ears, "when Rome has its grandest monument, we will have everything we've ever wanted. Our name will be carved in stone for 1,000 years." Claudia's eyes held a sadness that cut deeper than any blade. "Will you be alive to see it, Marcus? Or will you work yourself to death for the glory of dead emperors?" Before he could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the street. A sharp rap at the door sent ice through his veins. Imperial messengers at this hour meant only one thing: crisis or summons, neither of which boded well for a man whose life balanced on the whims of Caesar. The messenger wore the purple-striped tunic of the Praetorian Guard, his bronzed face expressionless beneath his crested helmet. "Marcus Livius Aquila, you are commanded to appear before Emperor Vespasian at the 3rd hour. Bring your plans." Marcus's throat went dry. "Has something happened at the construction site?" "The Emperor will speak with you himself." The guard's tone brooked no questions. "Do not be late." The streets of Rome pulsed with their usual morning chaos as Marcus made his way toward the Palatine Hill. Merchants hawked their wares from wooden stalls, their voices mixing with the creak of ox-drawn carts and the shuffle of sandaled feet. The air was thick with the scent of baking bread, roasting meat, and the ever-present dust kicked up by thousands of daily travelers. Rome was healing, slowly but surely, from the wounds inflicted by Nero's madness. The Great Fire had scarred the city's flesh, but Vespasian's steady hand had begun the work of restoration. New buildings rose where ash had once settled, their marble facades gleaming like white teeth in the morning sun. The people walked with more confidence now, though they still cast wary glances at the imperial guards who patrolled the streets. The taxes were crushing, Marcus knew. Every citizen felt the weight of financing the emperor's grand projects. In the taverns, men grumbled about the levies imposed to fund public works, even as they took pride in Rome's renewed magnificence. The empire demanded spectacle, and spectacle required gold. Gold wrung from the sweat of farmers and merchants, artisans and soldiers. The imperial palace loomed ahead, its terraced gardens cascading down the hillside like a green waterfall. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the gates. Guards scrutinized his scroll of credentials before allowing him passage into the marble-columned corridors that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. Emperor Vespasian sat behind a massive desk of polished oak, his weathered face bearing the lines of a man who had seen too much war and too little peace. Beside him stood his son Titus, whose eyes held the calculating intelligence that would one day make him emperor in his own right. Aquila. Vespasian's voice was gravelly, worn smooth by decades of command. Your amphitheater progresses well. Yes, Caesar. The foundations are nearly complete, and the hypogeum will be magnificent, I'm certain. The emperor rose, his purple-striped toga rustling. But I have a greater task for you. The amphitheater must be more than grand, it must be legendary. I want every citizen of Rome to look upon it and remember that the Flavian dynasty brought them glory beyond measure. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. What does Caesar require? 50,000 seats, Titus interjected, his voice carrying the authority of future power. For stories of arches, a canvas system to shade the crowds, and your hypogeum must accommodate spectacles that will make the gods themselves weep with wonder. The magnitude of the vision struck Marcus like a physical blow. No structure in human history had ever approached such scale. The technical challenges alone would push the boundaries of engineering knowledge. And beneath it all, the moral weight of building a monument to death pressed down upon his soul. It will be done, Caesar, he heard himself say, though his mind reeled with the implications. As the sun set over the 7 hills that evening, Marcus stood on his roof terrace, gazing out over the city that had become his world. In his mind's eye, he could see the great amphitheater rising from the marshy valley where Nero's artificial lake had once reflected the tyrant's golden palace. The structure would dwarf every building in Rome, its limestone and travertine walls soaring toward the heavens like a man-made mountain. But in the gathering dusk, Marcus also saw the shadows cast by his ambition, the slaves who would die hauling stones, the gladiators who would bleed for entertainment, the beasts torn from distant lands to sate Roman bloodlust. His name would indeed be carved in stone, but it would be written in suffering as much as in glory. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Chapter 2: Stones and Slaves. Dawn broke over Rome like a bronze blade cutting through darkness, and Marcus Livius Aquila stood at the edge of what would become the greatest amphitheater the world had ever known. The marshy valley where Nero's artificial lake had once reflected the tyrant's folly now buzzed with the controlled chaos of 10,000 working men. Scaffolding rose from the earth like the ribs of some enormous beast, while the thunder of hammers and the grinding of stone filled the air with a symphony of creation. Marcus pulled his woolen cloak tighter against the morning chill and descended into the heart of the construction site. The foundations had taken shape over the past months, concentric rings of travertine and tuff that would support the weight of 50,000 spectators. But seeing the scale of his vision made real still took his breath away. The outer wall would rise 150 feet into the sky, its 4 tiers of arches creating a facade that would dwarf every other building in Rome. Master Aquila! The voice belonged to Gaius Petronius, his chief engineer, a grizzled veteran whose hands bore the scars of decades spent wrestling stone into submission. The morning shipment from Tivoli has arrived. Marcus followed Petronius through the maze of construction, stepping carefully around coils of rope and stacks of wooden planks. The air was thick with limestone dust that coated everything in a fine white powder, turning the workers into ghostly figures moving through a marble fog. From the hypogeum excavations came the sound of pickaxes biting into earth, mixed with the groans of men hauling baskets of soil up wooden ramps. At the site's eastern edge, a line of ox-drawn carts stretched back toward the city gates. Each cart bore blocks of creamy travertine, their surfaces still bearing the marks of the quarry chisels. The stone had been torn from the earth near Tivoli, where slaves worked from dawn to dusk cutting the limestone that would form the Colosseum's bones. Marcus had visited the quarries once, 3 months ago, and the memory still haunted his dreams. The slaves worked in teams of 6, their bronze-tipped chisels ringing against stone while overseers prowled with leather whips. The air had been thick with dust that turned their skin gray and filled their lungs with grit. Many would not live to see the amphitheater's completion, their bodies worn out by the relentless labor of feeding Rome's appetite for grandeur. The new shipment from Judea arrived yesterday, Petronius said, nodding toward a group of men unloading stone blocks. 37 of them, all strong enough for heavy work. Marcus's gaze followed the gesture to where a cluster of new slaves worked under the watchful eyes of Roman guards. These men were different from the usual mix of Gauls and Germans who made up most of the construction crews. Their skin was darker, weathered by desert sun, and their eyes held a particular kind of defeat that spoke of recent capture and fresh grief. One man in particular caught Marcus's attention. Tall and gaunt, with dark hair streaked prematurely gray, he moved with the careful economy of someone conserving strength for survival. His hands were calloused but skilled, and he handled the stone blocks with a mason's instinct for balance and leverage. When he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, Marcus saw the branded mark on his forearm, a crude C that marked him as a captive from the Judean revolt. This was Kiso, though Marcus did not yet know his name. The slave had been captured during the siege of Jerusalem, torn from his workshop where he had carved decorative stonework for the temple's outer courts. His wife and 2 young daughters had died in the flames that consumed the holy city, leaving him with nothing but the skills that had kept him alive through the slave markets of Damascus and Alexandria. Marcus watched as Kiso guided a massive travertine block onto a wooden sledge, his movements precise despite the chains that bound his ankles. The architect felt a familiar twist in his stomach, the same sensation that had plagued him since accepting this commission. Every stone in the amphitheater's walls would be cemented with human suffering, every arch supported by the broken bodies of the conquered. "Have the cranes been tested?" Marcus asked, forcing his attention back to the technical challenges at hand. "Aye, master. The new design with the triple pulley system can lift stones weighing 2,000 pounds. Petronius's voice carried the pride of a craftsman discussing his tools. The wooden scaffolding is sound, and the concrete mixture has been perfected. We can pour the foundations for the upper tiers within the month. Marcus nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the working slaves. The Roman appetite for spectacle demanded this monument, and the emperor's will could not be denied. But standing here among the dust and sweat and barely contained desperation, he wondered if the gods would forgive what they were building. A shout from the western wall drew his attention. A crane operator was having trouble with his winch, and a half-ton block of travertine swayed dangerously above a group of workers. Marcus hurried toward the crisis, his architect's mind automatically calculating stress loads and failure points. The slaves scattered as the block lurched sideways, but one man, an elderly Gaul with silver hair, stumbled and fell directly beneath the swaying stone. Without thinking, Kiso dropped his own burden and lunged forward, his chains clanking as he grabbed the old man's tunic and hauled him clear. The travertine block crashed into the earth where the Gaul had been lying, sending up a cloud of dust and stone chips. "You!" A guard's voice cracked like a whip. "Did anyone give you permission to leave your post?" Kiso straightened slowly, his dark eyes meeting the Roman's glare without flinching. "The man would have died." "That's not your concern, slave." The guard's hand moved to his belt, where a lead-weighted scourge hung ready for use. "Your concern is moving stones, not playing hero." Marcus stepped forward before the situation could escalate. The slave showed good judgment. A dead worker serves no one, and replacing him would cost time and money. The guard's face reddened, but he could not argue with the architect's logic. With a disgusted grunt, he turned away to berate other workers. The old Gaul pressed Kiso's hand briefly in gratitude before hobbling back to his duties. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself watching the Jewish slave with growing fascination. Kiso worked with mechanical precision, his scarred hands guiding stone and mortar with the skill of a master craftsman. But in his eyes, Marcus saw something that chilled him more than any winter wind. A complete absence of hope, replaced by the grim determination of a man who had learned to endure whatever fate demanded. The sun reached its zenith, and Marcus climbed the wooden scaffolding to survey the construction from above. The amphitheater's skeleton was taking shape, its concentric ovals spreading outward like ripples in a stone pond. In 10 years, this would be the heart of Roman entertainment, where senators and citizens would gather to watch gladiators die for their amusement. But today it was just stone and sweat, blood and mortar. Today it was men like Kiso, whose lives had been reduced to the space between sunrise and sunset, between one stone block and the next. Men who built monuments to glory while their own names would be forgotten with the next shipment of slaves. As evening approached and the work crews began to disperse, Marcus found himself standing near the material depot where tomorrow's stones waited in neat rows. Kiso was securing the last of the day's tools, his movements slow with exhaustion. Their eyes met across the construction site, architect and slave, Roman and Jew, the man who designed the cage and the man who would build it. In that moment, Marcus saw something that would haunt him through all the years of construction ahead. He saw not a beast of burden or a tool to be used, but a man whose humanity had been stripped away by the same system that promised to make Marcus immortal. The recognition passed between them like a spark jumping between two pieces of metal, brief but undeniable. Kiso was the first to look away, returning to his chains and his exhaustion. But Marcus stood frozen, staring at the place where the slave had been, wondering if the gods would judge him for what he was building, or for what he was becoming in the building of it. Chapter 3: The Emperor's Will. The evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine and cypress through the imperial gardens, where Emperor Vespasian sat beside a marble fountain that had once graced Nero's golden palace. The water trickled over carved dolphins and sea nymphs, its gentle music a stark contrast to the hammer blows that echoed across the city from the great construction site. At 69, Vespasian's weathered face bore the lines of a man who had clawed his way from provincial obscurity to the throne of the world, and tonight those lines seemed deeper than usual. He held a wax tablet in his calloused hands, reviewing the latest reports from his architects and engineers. The numbers were staggering: thousands of tons of travertine, millions of bricks, an army of slaves and skilled craftsmen working from dawn to dusk. The amphitheater would bankrupt a lesser empire, but Rome was not lesser, and Vespasian intended to prove it to every citizen who doubted the Flavian dynasty's right to rule. The hypocrisy of tyrants, he murmured to himself, watching a peacock strut across the manicured lawn. That very bird had once adorned Nero's private menagerie, kept for the mad emperor's amusement while Rome burned. Now it served a different master, one who understood that power flowed not from indulgence but from service, or at least the appearance of service. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his meditation. Titus emerged from the palace corridors, his purple-striped toga gleaming in the lamplight. At 39, the emperor's eldest son possessed the bearing of a natural commander, his dark eyes holding the calculating intelligence that had made him indispensable during the siege of Jerusalem. Tonight, however, those eyes blazed with an excitement that made Vespasian smile despite his weariness. "Father," Titus said, settling onto the marble bench beside him, "the Syrian merchants have confirmed their commitment. 50 leopards, 20 lions, and 6 elephants will arrive before the dedication games." Vespasian set down his tablet, studying his son's animated features. "And the cost? Considerable but manageable. The treasury can bear it, especially with the gold we've recovered from the Jewish revolt." Titus's voice carried the confidence of a man who had never known true want. "The people will remember these games for generations. They'll speak of the day the Flavians gave Rome the greatest spectacle in human history." The emperor's weathered hands traced the edge of the fountain, where carved tritons raised their horns in eternal celebration. "Do you know what this fountain cost Nero?" "No, father. More than most citizens earn in a lifetime." He commissioned it for his private garden, where he could watch dolphins play while Romans starved in the streets. Vespasian's voice hardened. "Now it serves a different purpose. Every citizen who enters our garden sees it and remembers that we are not Nero." Titus nodded, though his enthusiasm remained undimmed. "The amphitheater will serve the same purpose, but on a grander scale. Where Nero built a lake for his own pleasure, we're building an arena for the people's entertainment." "Entertainment," Vespasian repeated, the word carrying weight in his mouth. "Is that what we're calling it?" Before Titus could answer, the soft shuffle of sandals announced the arrival of other figures. Senator Lucius Nerva approached with measured steps, his toga praetexta marking him as one of Rome's most senior magistrates. Behind him came Gaius Suetonius, the imperial secretary, and Marcus Ulpius Traianus, a rising star in the military hierarchy whose loyalty to the Flavian cause had proven invaluable. "Caesar," Nerva said, offering the traditional salute, "we have reviewed the latest expenditure reports for the amphitheater project." "And?" Vespasian's tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The costs are substantial. The Syrian merchants alone are demanding payment in gold, not silver. The stone quarries require additional slaves, and the engineering challenges have proven more complex than anticipated. Nerva's patrician features remained composed, but his concern was evident. Some members of the Senate are beginning to question whether such expenditure is wise, given the recent wars. Traianus stepped forward, his soldiers bearing evident in every movement. Caesar, if I may, the legions in Germania and Britannia are solid, but discontent simmers in the eastern provinces. The people there remember Nero's excesses and fear a return to such madness. A grand gesture, something that demonstrates imperial generosity rather than greed, could prevent more serious troubles. Bread and circuses, Suetonius added quietly. The poet Juvenal was not wrong about what keeps the people content. Vespasian rose from the bench, his joints protesting the movement. Walk with me. The group moved through the garden paths, past beds of roses and carefully tended olive trees. Oil lamps flickered in bronze holders, casting dancing shadows on the marble statues that lined the walkways. In the distance, the city of Rome sprawled beneath them, its countless fires twinkling like earthbound stars. You speak of bread and circuses, Vespasian said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. But what you're really discussing is the price of empire. Every denarius we spend on spectacle is a denarius we cannot spend on legions, on roads, on aqueducts. The question is not whether we can afford these games, but whether we can afford not to hold them. Titus moved to his father's side, his face illuminated by the lamplight. The amphitheater will stand for centuries, Father. Long after we're dust, citizens will gather there to witness the might of Rome. They'll remember that the Flavians gave them something eternal. Eternal, Vespasian mused, a dangerous word for mortal men to use. The emperor paused beside a marble statue of victory, her wings spread wide in triumph. The sculpture had been salvaged from Nero's palace, but the inscription at its base now bore the Flavian name. History, Vespasian reflected, was written by those who controlled the chisels. Eternal, Vespasian mused, a dangerous word for mortal men to use. The emperor paused beside a marble statue of victory, her wings spread wide in triumph. The sculpture had been salvaged from Nero's palace, but the inscription at its base now bore the Flavian name. History, Vespasian reflected, was written by those who controlled the chisels. I've been thinking about the inaugural games, Titus continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man outlining battle plans. 100 days of continuous spectacle. We'll begin with beast hunts featuring animals from every corner of the empire. Lions from Africa, bears from Germania, crocodiles from the Nile. And gladiators? Nerva asked. Of course, but not just individual combat. We'll stage historical battles, the siege of Troy, perhaps, or the conquest of Britannia. The people love spectacle, but they also love stories that remind them of Rome's glory. Vespasian nodded slowly. And Naumachii? The engineers assure me it's possible. The hypogeum can be flooded through a series of channels connected to the aqueduct system. We'll recreate the Battle of Salamis, complete with warships and naval combat. Titus's eyes gleamed with anticipation. Imagine it, Father. 50,000 citizens watching Persian and Greek fleets clash in the heart of Rome. The technical challenges alone were staggering. Vespasian had seen the preliminary drawings that Marcus Livius Aquila had prepared. Complex systems of pipes and drains that would allow the arena floor to be flooded and emptied at will. The engineering was brilliant, but the human cost would be enormous. Hundreds of slaves would die in the construction, and thousands more would perish in the games themselves. "The people will love it," Suetonius said quietly. "They'll forget their taxes, their hardships, their doubts about imperial policy. For 100 days, they'll believe they're the luckiest citizens in the world." "And afterward?" Vespasian asked. "Afterward, they'll remember us as the emperors who gave them the greatest gift in Roman history." The group had reached the palace's eastern balcony, where a panoramic view of the city spread before them. Below, the Colosseum construction site blazed with torchlight as night crews continued their work. The skeleton of the great amphitheater rose from the earth like the bones of some primordial beast, its oval form already dominating the landscape. Vespasian gripped the marble balustrade, feeling the weight of empire settling on his shoulders like a funeral shroud. "I won't live to see it completed," he said quietly. "This monument will be your legacy, not mine." Titus placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "It will be our legacy, father. The amphitheater that replaced Nero's lake. The gift that proved the Flavians served Rome, not themselves." In the distance, a work crew was maneuvering a massive stone block into position, their torches casting wild shadows on the construction site. Vespasian could almost see the finished structure in his mind. For stories of gleaming travertine, its arches filled with the roar of 50,000 voices demanding blood and spectacle. "Sometimes I wonder," he said, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze, "whether we're building a monument to Roman greatness or a monument to Roman madness." Titus's grip tightened on his shoulder. "History will judge us, father, but history is written by the survivors, and Rome will survive because of what we're building down there." As the night deepened and the palace grew quiet, Titus remained on the balcony long after the others had retired. The torches at the construction site burned like earthbound stars, and in their flickering light, he could see the future taking shape. 100 days of games. 100 days of spectacle that would cement the Flavian dynasty's place in history. The amphitheater would be more than stone and mortar. It would be the physical manifestation of Roman power, a permanent reminder that the empire's reach extended from the freezing forests of Germania to the burning sands of Africa. And at its heart would be the arena, where life and death would play out their eternal drama for the entertainment of citizens who had never known defeat. Titus smiled, his dark eyes reflecting the distant torchlight. The greatest spectacle in human history was taking shape before his eyes, and he would be the one to unleash it upon the world. Chapter 4. Gladiator's Fate. The iron shackles around Lucius Vero's wrists had worn raw circles into his skin, but he no longer felt the pain. 3 months had passed since Roman legions had swept through his village in the Thracian mountains, leaving nothing but ash and memories in their wake. Now, as he stood in the shadow of the Ludus Magnus, the greatest gladiator school in Rome, he felt the weight of his new reality settling upon his shoulders like a burial shroud. The training compound sprawled before him like a miniature fortress, its high walls topped with iron spikes and patrolled by armed guards. Through the main gate, Lucius could see a sandy courtyard where dozens of men practiced with wooden swords, their movements fluid and deadly despite their bonds. The air rang with the clash of weapons and the harsh shouts of trainers, creating a symphony of violence that would become the soundtrack of his new life. "Fresh meat," growled the lanista, a scarred giant named Gaius Drusus whose left arm bore the mark of a gladiator's brand. "This one's young, but he's got the look of a fighter. See how he holds his head. Pride hasn't been beaten out of him yet." Lucius said nothing, though his gray eyes burned with barely contained fury. In his mind, He could still hear the screams of his village burning, could still see his father's broken body lying in the mud outside their stone hut. The Romans had come at dawn, their shields gleaming like mirrors in the morning sun, and by noon his world had ended. "You understand Latin, boy?" Drusus demanded, grabbing Lucius's chin with fingers like iron clamps. "Yes." The word came out as a rasp, his throat raw from weeks of shouting defiance during the slave march to Rome. "Good. That'll save us both some trouble." Drusus released him with a shove that sent Lucius stumbling backward. "Listen carefully, because I'll only say this once. You're no longer Lucius of Thrace. You're no longer the son of whatever mountain chief sired you. You're a gladiator of the Ludus Magnus, and your life belongs to Rome now." The lanista began walking toward the training yard, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel path. Lucius followed, his own bare feet silent on the stones. Around them, other slaves moved with the careful economy of men who had learned to conserve their strength for survival. "You'll train 6 hours each day," Drusus continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Weapons practice, physical conditioning, combat techniques. You'll eat what we give you, sleep where we put you, and fight when we tell you to fight. The lucky ones die quickly. The skilled ones live long enough to earn their freedom." They entered the main courtyard, where the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the sand-covered ground. Lucius's eyes swept over the training gladiators, taking in their muscled frames and battle scars. These men had been forged in the crucible of arena combat, their bodies turned into weapons through endless repetition and brutal discipline. "That's your bunk?" Drusus pointed toward a long wooden building that served as the gladiators' barracks. "You'll share it with 20 other men. The veteran beside you is Cassius. He's been here 4 years and won 17 matches. Listen to him if you want to live." Lucius nodded, though his attention was drawn to a massive man practicing with a trident and net near the far wall. The fighter moved with fluid grace despite his size, his weapon spinning in complex patterns that seemed to defy physics. Sweat gleamed on his dark skin, and his breathing remained steady despite the intensity of his workout. "That's Brutus," Drusus said, following Lucius's gaze. "He's a retiarius, fights with net and trident. Been champion of the school for 2 years running. Cross him and you'll find yourself on the wrong end of his fishing spear." The sound of wood striking wood drew Lucius's attention to another section of the yard, where younger gladiators practiced basic sword forms with wooden training weapons. Their movements were still clumsy, their timing off, but their dedication was evident in every drop of sweat that fell to the sand. "You'll start there," Drusus said. "Basic forms, footwork, defensive positions. Most of you will die in your first match because you think courage is enough. It isn't. Skill keeps you alive. Discipline keeps you alive. Luck keeps you alive. Courage just gets you killed faster." As if summoned by the lanista's words, a man emerged from the barracks carrying a wooden practice sword. He was older than Lucius, perhaps 30, with graying hair and a network of scars across his arms and chest. His eyes held the weary wisdom of someone who had seen too much death and learned to make peace with it. "Cassius," Drusus called, "new fish for you to teach. Try to keep this one alive long enough to be useful." Cassius approached with the measured gait of a professional soldier, his scarred hands gripping the practice sword with casual familiarity. "What's your name, boy?" "Lucius Varro." "Forget it. In here, you're just another dead man walking." Cassius's tone was matter-of-fact, devoid of cruelty but also devoid of hope. "How old are you?" 22. Old enough to know better, young enough to learn. Good. Cassius tossed him a wooden sword, its weight unfamiliar in his hands. Show me what you know. Lucius had trained with weapons since childhood, learning the warrior's arts from his father and the other men of his village. But gladiatorial combat was different. More brutal, more desperate, designed to entertain crowds rather than win battles. The first time Cassius struck him, the practiced sword cracked against his ribs with enough force to drop him to his knees. Too slow, Cassius said, offering him a hand up. You fight like a soldier, but we're not soldiers anymore. We're performers. The crowd wants blood, wants drama, wants to see men die with style. The training continued until sunset, by which time Lucius's body was a map of bruises and his hands were raw from gripping the unfamiliar weapon. But he had learned something valuable. These men were not just slaves or criminals waiting to die. They were artists of violence, craftsmen who had turned killing into an art form. That night, as he lay on his straw pallet in the crowded barracks, Lucius listened to the quiet conversations of his fellow gladiators. Some spoke of families left behind, others of dreams of freedom that grew more distant with each passing day. A few boasted of their victories, while others prayed to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. You thinking about home? Cassius asked from the neighboring bunk. Always. Don't. Home is what gets you killed in the arena. When you're fighting for your life, you can't be thinking about your mother's cooking or your girl's smile. You have to be here in the moment, focused on the blade coming at your throat. Lucius closed his eyes, but sleep brought no peace. In his dreams, he saw his village burning again, saw his younger sister Vara running toward him with tears streaming down her face. She had been only 16 when the Romans came, barely old enough to understand what was happening. He had tried to reach her, but the soldiers had cut him down before he could take 3 steps. I'll come back, he had promised her as they dragged him away in chains. I'll win my freedom and come back for you. But lying in the darkness of the gladiator barracks, that promise felt as distant as the stars. How many men had made similar vows? How many had died with their loved ones' names on their lips? The next morning brought more training, more pain, more lessons in the art of dying well. Lucius learned to move like a gladiator, to think like a gladiator, to accept that his life was no longer his own. But deep inside, where the trainer's whips could not reach, a spark of defiance continued to burn. Days blended into weeks and weeks into months. Lucius grew stronger, faster, more skilled with each passing session. He learned to read an opponent's intentions in the set of their shoulders, to anticipate attacks from the shift of their weight. He discovered that survival required more than just physical prowess. It demanded intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to give the crowd what they wanted without actually dying in the process. You thinking about home? Cassius asked from the neighboring bunk. Always. Don't. Home is what gets you killed in the arena. When you're fighting for your life, you can't be thinking about your mother's cooking or your girl's smile. You have to be here in the moment, focused on the blade coming at your throat. Lucius closed his eyes, but sleep brought no peace. In his dreams, he saw his village burning again, saw his younger sister Vara running toward him with tears streaming down her face. She had been only 16 when the Romans came, barely old enough to understand what was happening. He had tried to reach her, but the soldiers had cut him down before he could take 3 steps. I'll come back, he had promised her as they dragged him away in chains. I'll win my freedom and come back for you. But lying in the darkness of the gladiator barracks, that promise felt as distant as the stars. How many men had made similar vows? How many had died with their loved ones' names on their lips? The next morning brought more training, more pain, more lessons in the art of dying well. Lucius learned to move like a gladiator, to think like a gladiator, to accept that his life was no longer his own. But deep inside, where the trainer's whips could not reach, a spark of defiance continued to burn. Days blended into weeks and weeks into months. Lucius grew stronger, faster, more skilled with each passing session. He learned to read an opponent's intentions in the set of their shoulders, to anticipate attacks from the shift of their weight. He discovered that survival required more than just physical prowess. It demanded intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to give the crowd what they wanted without actually dying in the process. "You're ready," Cassius announced one evening after a particularly brutal training session. "Drusus will put you on the roster for the next games." Lucius felt his stomach clench. When? 3 days. Some minor festival honoring Mars. Nothing too elaborate, just a few preliminary matches before the main event. Cassius's expression was unreadable. "You'll fight a condemned criminal, probably some cutthroat from the provinces who chose the arena over crucifixion." That night, Lucius stood in the training yard after the other gladiators had retired to their bunks. The moon was full, casting silver light on the sand where so many men had spilled their blood in practice. In the distance, the Colosseum rose like a mountain of white stone, its arches gleaming in the moonlight. The great amphitheater was nearing completion, its final stones being set into place by torchlight. Soon, it would open with the grandest games in Roman history, and Lucius knew that his fate was now inextricably linked to that monument. He would fight in its shadow, perhaps die in its embrace, all for the entertainment of citizens who saw him as nothing more than a weapon made of flesh and bone. But as he stood there in the silver darkness, Lucius made a silent vow to the gods of his ancestors. He would not die forgotten in the sand. He would not become just another corpse to be dragged away by the death cruise. He would survive, he would win, and someday he would return to the mountains of Thrace to honor the dead and reclaim what the Romans had stolen from him. The Colosseum waited, patient as death itself, its arches promising glory and demanding blood in equal measure. And Lucius Varro, slave and gladiator, son of Thrace and prisoner of Rome, would meet that promise with steel in his hand and fire in his heart. Chapter 5: Blood on the Sand. The morning of the inaugural games dawned clear and bright, as if the gods themselves had conspired to witness the birth of Rome's greatest monument. From his cell beneath the arena, Lucius Varro could hear the rumble of 50,000 voices growing steadily louder as the amphitheater filled with spectators. The sound was like distant thunder, rolling across the city and shaking the very foundations of the hypogeum where he waited with his fellow gladiators. Above them, the Colosseum blazed in the morning sun, its 4 tiers of travertine arches gleaming like polished bone. The Valerium, a massive canvas awning, had been stretched across portions of the arena to shield the privileged spectators from the heat. Sailors from the imperial fleet worked the complex system of ropes and pulleys, their movements precise and practiced despite the unprecedented scale of the operation. In the seats of honor, senators adjusted their purple-striped togas and murmured among themselves about the cost of the spectacle. The Vestal virgins sat in their reserved section, their white robes a stark contrast to the colorful crowd surrounding them. Below them, the plebeians packed the wooden benches, their voices rising in anticipation as vendors moved through the aisles selling garum-soaked bread, honeyed dates, and watered wine. The air itself seemed to vibrate with excitement. Trumpets blared from the upper galleries, their bronze notes cutting through the crowd's roar. The scent of dust and sweat mingled with the aroma of food and the sharp smell of the sawdust that had been spread across the arena floor to absorb the blood that would soon stain it. In the imperial box, Emperor Titus stood at the marble balustrade, his purple toga flowing in the morning breeze. At 39, he commanded the respect of both the mob and the aristocracy, his bearing radiating the confidence of a man who had conquered Jerusalem and now sought to conquer the hearts of his people. Today would cement his legacy as the emperor who had given Rome its greatest gift. Magnificent, he murmured to himself, surveying the packed amphitheater. Absolutely magnificent. Below in the hypogeum, Lucius strapped on his leather arm guards with fingers that trembled slightly despite months of training. The familiar weight of his gladius hung at his side, its edge honed to razor sharpness. Beside him, Cassius sat in grim silence, his scarred face a mask of professional calm. "Remember what I taught you," the veteran whispered. "The crowd wants a show, not just a slaughter. Give them drama, give them fear, give them hope. But most importantly, give them victory." Lucius nodded, though his throat felt dry as parchment. In his mind, he could still see his sister Vara's face, still hear her voice calling his name as the Romans dragged him away. That memory had sustained him through months of brutal training, had given him the strength to endure beatings and humiliation and the constant threat of death. The sound of metal grating against stone echoed through the underground passages as the arena's elaborate lift system began to operate. Marcus Livius Aquila's ingenious design allowed gladiators, animals, and stage props to be raised directly into the arena through hidden trapdoors, creating the illusion of magic for the spectators above. "Time to go," Cassius said, rising from his bench. "Die well, brother." The elevator platform shuddered as it began its ascent, carrying Lucius and 3 other gladiators toward the surface. Through the gaps in the wooden flooring, he could see the complex machinery of the hypogeum, the network of corridors, the animal cages, the storage rooms filled with weapons and costumes. This was Marcus's masterpiece, the hidden heart of the amphitheater that made the spectacle possible. Light exploded around them as they emerged into the arena proper. The roar of the crowd hit Lucius like a physical blow. 50,000 voices united in a primal scream of bloodlust and excitement. The sand beneath his feet was pristine white, imported from the beaches of Egypt specifically for these games. Within minutes, it would be stained crimson. Across the arena, another elevator platform delivered his opponents. 3 condemned criminals who had chosen the gladiator's death over crucifixion. Their faces were painted with the ritual colors of the condemned, their bodies marked with the brands of their crimes. They would fight with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. In the seats of honor, Marcus Livius Aquila watched the proceedings with emotions as complex as the machinery he had designed. Pride swelled in his chest as he saw his architectural vision made real, the perfect acoustics that carried every clash of weapons to the furthest seats, the sophisticated drainage system that would allow the arena to be flooded for naval battles, the hundreds of small details that had consumed years of his life. But that pride was tainted with something darker, a growing horror at what his creation had unleashed. The crowd's bloodlust was palpable, a living thing that seemed to feed on the violence unfolding below. Children laughed and pointed at the gladiators, their young faces bright with excitement at the prospect of watching men die. Women clutched their husbands' arms, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and arousal. The gladiators began their deadly dance, circling each other with the careful precision of trained killers. Lucius's first opponent was a Gaul, tall and lean with intricate tattoos covering his arms. The man fought with a curved sword and small shield, his movements fluid and deceptively graceful. Steel rang against steel as they engaged, the sound echoing off the arena walls and mixing with the crowd's roar. Lucius felt the familiar surge of combat adrenaline, the heightened awareness that came with fighting for his life. Time seemed to slow as he parried a thrust aimed at his throat, countered with a slice that opened a shallow wound on his opponent's arm. The Gaul pressed his attack, his blade weaving complex patterns in the air. Lucius gave ground, his sandals sliding on the sand as he absorbed the assault. But he had learned patience from Cassius, had learned to wait for the precise moment when aggression became vulnerability. It came when the Gaul overextended himself, lunging forward with a killing stroke that would have ended the fight. Lucius sidestepped at the last instant, his own blade finding the gap between his opponent's ribs. The man's eyes widened in shock and pain, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers as he collapsed to the sand. The crowd erupted in approval, their voices rising to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very stones of the amphitheater. Lucius stood over his fallen opponent, his chest heaving with exertion, his blade dripping crimson onto the white sand. The Gaul was still alive, his eyes pleading for mercy, but the crowd's verdict was clear. Thumbs turned downward throughout the arena, sealing the man's fate. Lucius looked up at the imperial box, where Emperor Titus sat with his thumb extended horizontally, the gesture that would determine whether the defeated gladiator lived or died. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the emperor's gaze met his, and Lucius saw something unexpected in those imperial eyes. Not cruelty, but a kind of weary acceptance, as if Titus himself was trapped by the spectacle he had created. The thumb turned downward. Lucius's blade found the Gaul's throat with practiced precision, ending his suffering quickly and cleanly. The man's blood soaked into the sand, the first offering to the gods of the arena. The crowd's approval washed over him like a tide, but instead of elation, Lucius felt only emptiness. He had won, he had survived, but the victory felt hollow somehow. Two more opponents remained, and the dance of death continued. A Syrian with a trident and net proved more challenging, his weapon giving him reach advantage and the ability to entangle Lucius's sword. But the Retiarius made the mistake of becoming too confident, playing to the crowd instead of focusing on his opponent. Lucius's gladius found the gap in his defense, piercing his heart with a single, decisive thrust. The final opponent was little more than a boy, perhaps 17 years old, his face pale with terror beneath the ritual paint. He held his sword with shaking hands, his eyes darting frantically around the arena as if seeking an escape that didn't exist. The crowd's bloodlust had reached a fever pitch, and they screamed for violence with voices hoarse from cheering. Lucius approached the boy slowly, his blade steady despite the weight of what he was about to do. In the youth's terrified features, he saw something that made his heart clench, a resemblance to his own young sister, the same wide eyes and delicate bone structure. For a moment he hesitated, and in that hesitation, the boy attacked. The desperate lunge was clumsy and poorly timed, but it carried the strength of panic. Lucius deflected the blade easily, his own weapon moving almost of its own accord. The boy's blood sprayed across the sand as he fell, his life ending before he had truly learned to live. The crowd's roar reached a deafening crescendo as Lucius raised his sword in triumph. Flower petals rained down from the upper tiers, and women threw silk scarves onto the sand. He had given them what they wanted: blood, death, and the illusion of heroism. But as he stood there, breathing hard in the afternoon heat, he felt something die within himself. From his seat in the dignitaries section, Marcus Livius Aquila watched the victorious gladiator with a mixture of admiration and horror. The young Thracian had fought with skill and courage, but Marcus could see the toll the violence had taken. The gladiator's eyes were no longer those of a man but of a weapon, honed to perfection by necessity and circumstance. This was what his architectural masterpiece had created: a machine for converting human beings into instruments of death and entertainment. The engineering was flawless, the spectacle magnificent, but the cost was measured in souls rather than gold. As the crowd's cheers began to fade, Marcus found himself looking directly at the gladiator below. Across the distance that separated architect from fighter, their eyes met for a brief moment. In that instant, Marcus saw not a savage killer but a man trapped by circumstances beyond his control, just as he himself was trapped by the ambitions that had driven him to create this monument to Roman power. The gladiator's gaze held no accusation, no hatred for the man who had designed his cage. Instead, there was only a kind of weary recognition, as if he understood that they were both prisoners of the same system, both slaves to the same imperial will. The moment passed, and the gladiator was escorted back to the hypogeum to await his next fight. But Marcus continued to stare at the blood-stained sand, wondering if the gods would forgive him for what he had built, or if his name would be remembered not as a creator of beauty, but as an architect of suffering. Above them all, the Colosseum stood eternal and impassive, its arches framing a sky that seemed to have grown darker since the games began. The crowd began to disperse, their bloodlust temporarily sated, but the arena itself remained, patient and hungry, waiting for the next offering of human flesh and imperial ambition. In the growing shadows of evening, the sand soaked up the last of the day's blood, and the stones themselves seemed to whisper with the voices of the dead. The games would continue tomorrow, and the day after, and for generations to come. But for now, in the quiet that followed the storm of violence, even the eternal city seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what new horrors and glories would emerge from the heart of the empire. Chapter 6. The Slaves' Revolt. The thunderous roar of 50,000 voices filtered down through tons of stone and timber, creating a muffled symphony that seemed to make the very walls of the hypogeum pulse with life. In the damp corridors beneath the Colosseum's arena floor, Kiso pressed his scarred palm against the cold travertine blocks he had helped set in place, feeling the vibrations of the spectacle above travel through his bones. The irony was not lost on him. He was about to use his intimate knowledge of the stone prison to orchestrate the most dangerous gamble of his life. The guards will change shifts when the beast hunts begin, he whispered to the three men crouched beside him in the narrow maintenance tunnel. His voice was barely audible above the distant clash of weapons and the crowd's frenzied cheering. We have perhaps 20 minutes before they discover us missing. The amber glow of a single oil lamp cast their faces in stark relief against the darkness. Beside him, Matthias, a fellow Judean captured during the siege of Jerusalem, gripped a chisel they had stolen from the construction supplies. His hands shook, whether from fear or anticipation, Kiso could not tell. The other two, Brennus, a Gaul with prematurely gray hair, and Darius, a Syrian whose dark eyes held the haunted look of a man who had lost everything, nodded their understanding. Above them, the crowd erupted in another wave of bloodthirsty approval. Through the intricate network of drainage channels that Marcus Livius Aquila had designed to flood the arena for naval battles, Kiso could hear the wet sound of steel meeting flesh, the final gasps of dying men, the scrape of bodies being dragged across sand. Each sound was a reminder of what awaited them if they were caught. The Eastern Passage, Kiso continued, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. It leads to the old construction tunnel that connects to the sewer system. From there, we can reach the Tiber. Before dawn, he had discovered the forgotten passage 3 months ago while hauling stone blocks through the hypogeum's maze-like corridors. The tunnel had been sealed with loose mortar during the final stages of construction, but Kiso had carefully worked at the barrier during the long nights, chipping away fragments of cement when the guards were distracted. His knowledge of the Colosseum's hidden arteries was more complete than even Marcus himself possessed, the desperate awareness of a man who had memorized every potential escape route. And then, Brennus asked, his Gallic accent thick with tension, "Where do we go when we reach the river?" Kiso's jaw tightened. He had not told them the full truth, that his plan ended at the Tiber's banks, that he had no connections in the city, no safe houses or sympathetic souls waiting to shelter runaway slaves. Beyond the river lay only the vast uncertainty of a world that viewed them as property to be reclaimed. "We survive," he said simply. "We find a way to live as free men, even if only for a day." The distant sound of trumpets signaled the beginning of the beast hunts, and Kiso felt his pulse quicken. Throughout the hypogeum, the remaining slaves would be focused on their duties, hauling fresh sand to cover the bloodstains, preparing the elaborate mechanical lifts that would raise exotic animals into the arena, maintaining the complex systems that made the spectacle possible. The guards would be watching the entertainment above, their attention divided between security and the magnetic pull of violence. "Now," he breathed. They moved through the darkness like wraiths, their bare feet silent on the damp stone. Kiso led them through passages so narrow they had to move single file, past storage chambers filled with weapons and stage props, around the massive counterweight systems that operated the arena's elevators. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with the scent of standing water and the acrid smell of oil-soaked torches. Behind them, the hypogeum continued its mechanical orchestration of death. Somewhere in the network of corridors, a lion roared as it was prepared for transport to the arena above. The sound echoed off the stone walls, primal and terrifying, reminding them that they were not the only prisoners seeking freedom in this underground labyrinth. Kiso's fingers found the loose stones he had marked, and he began working at the concealed entrance to the abandoned tunnel. The mortar crumbled away in his hands, fragments of cement falling to the floor with soft pattering sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the underground chill, and his breath came in short, controlled gasps. "There," he whispered as the opening widened enough for a man to squeeze through. One at a time, quietly, Matthias went first, his thin frame disappearing into the darkness beyond. Darius followed, then Brennus, each man pausing to clasp Kiso's hand briefly before vanishing into the tunnel. The touch of their fingers was like a farewell, an acknowledgement that they might never see each other again. Kiso was about to follow when the sound of approaching footsteps froze him in place. The measured tread of hobnailed boots on stone echoed through the corridor, growing steadily closer. A guard making his rounds, perhaps, or worse, a supervisor conducting an unexpected inspection. He pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain it would betray him. The footsteps passed within arm's reach, and he caught. Within arm's reach, and he caught a glimpse of torchlight flickering across the opposite wall. The guard paused, and Kiso heard the man's breathing, deep and steady, as he listened for any unusual sounds. The moment stretched into eternity. Above them, the crowd's roar reached a new crescendo, and the guard's attention seemed to drift upward toward the spectacle. With infinite care, Kiso slipped through the opening in the wall, his body scraping against the rough stone as he squeezed into the forgotten tunnel. The passage was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, its walls slick with moisture and decades of accumulated grime. Kiso moved forward in absolute darkness, his hands extended before him, feeling for obstacles. The air was stale and thick, carrying the fetid smell of the city's waste that flowed through the sewers below. Behind him, he heard the guards' footsteps resume their patrol, growing fainter as the man moved away. But Kiso knew their absence would be discovered soon. The supervisors kept careful counts of their human property, and for missing slaves would not go unnoticed for long. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but finally Kiso saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. He emerged into a wider passage where the others waited, their faces pale with relief and exhaustion. Before them stretched the ancient sewer system that had served Rome for centuries, its brick-lined channels carrying the city's waste toward the Tiber. "The river is less than a mile," Kiso said, his voice echoing strangely in the larger space. "We follow the flow, stay in the shadows." The sound of shouting from behind them cut off his words. Even through the thick stone walls, they could hear the alarm being raised, the harsh voices of guards calling out orders, the clatter of weapons and running feet. "They know," Brennus whispered, his face gone ashen. "They've discovered we're gone." Above them, the games continued, but Kiso could imagine the chaos now spreading through the hypogeum. Guards would be sealing exits, searching every corridor, every storage chamber, every hidden corner where desperate men might hide. The systematic hunt would begin, and their head start was already evaporating. "Move," Kiso commanded, and they plunged deeper into the sewer system, their feet splashing through ankle-deep water that reeked of human waste and rotting refuse. The walls pressed close around them, and the darkness seemed to swallow their footsteps. In the dignitaries section of the Colosseum, Marcus Livius Aquila sat with his hands clenched in his lap, watching a pack of lions tear apart a condemned criminal on the arena floor below. The crowd's bloodlust washed over him like a tide, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the architectural marvel that surrounded him. Every arch, every column, every hidden mechanism was his creation, his legacy carved in stone and sealed with human suffering. A commotion in the corridor behind the seats caught his attention. Imperial guards were moving with unusual urgency, their faces grim as they whispered among themselves. Marcus felt a chill of premonition settle in his stomach. "Master Aquila," a voice called softly. He turned to see Gaius Petronius, his chief engineer, approaching with careful steps. The man's face was pale, his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. "What is it?" Marcus asked, though he already dreaded the answer. "There's been an incident," Petronius whispered, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. "For slaves have disappeared from the hypogeum. The guards are searching, but—" he shook his head. "They used knowledge of the construction to escape. Someone who understood the building's secrets." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. His architectural masterpiece, his carefully planned monument to Roman glory, had been turned against itself. Worse, if the escaped slaves were recaptured and interrogated, they might reveal details about the Colosseum's construction that could embarrass the imperial family. Security weaknesses, design flaws, evidence of the human cost that had been hidden from public view. "Have they been found?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Not yet, but the Praetorian Guard has been notified. If they reach the city..." Petronius didn't need to finish the thought. Runaway slaves in Rome would be hunted down with relentless efficiency, and when they were caught, their punishment would be swift and brutal. Marcus closed his eyes, seeing in his mind's eye the network of tunnels and passages that honeycombed the Colosseum's foundations. He had designed them for efficiency, for the smooth flow of men and animals to their deaths. Now those same passages might become the escape route for desperate souls seeking freedom. In the arena below, the lions finished their grisly work, and the crowd cheered as slaves with rakes began clearing the blood-soaked sand. But Marcus no longer saw the spectacle. Instead, he saw the face of the Jewish slave who had saved the old Gaul from the falling stone, the man whose dark eyes had held such depth of suffering and quiet dignity. "Find them," he told Petronius, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Find them before the emperor learns of this." As his engineer hurried away, Marcus remained in his seat, staring at the arena floor where fresh sand was being spread to cover the stains of violence. Around him, the crowd continued to roar its approval, but he could barely hear them over the sound of his own racing heart. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. His architectural masterpiece, his carefully planned monument to Roman glory, had been turned against itself. Worse, if the escaped slaves were recaptured and interrogated, they might reveal details about the Colosseum's construction that could embarrass the imperial family. Security weaknesses, design flaws, evidence of the human cost that had been hidden from public view. "Have they been found?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Not yet, but the Praetorian Guard has been notified. If they reach the city..." Petronius didn't need to finish the thought. Runaway slaves in Rome would be hunted down with relentless efficiency, and when they were caught, their punishment would be swift and brutal. Marcus closed his eyes, seeing in his mind's eye the network of tunnels and passages that honeycombed the Colosseum's foundations. He had designed them for efficiency, for the smooth flow of men and animals to their deaths. Now those same passages might become the escape route for desperate souls seeking freedom. In the arena below, the lions finished their grisly work, and the crowd cheered as slaves with rakes began clearing the blood-soaked sand. But Marcus no longer saw the spectacle. Instead, he saw the face of the Jewish slave who had saved the old Gaul from the falling stone, the man whose dark eyes had held such depth of suffering and quiet dignity. "Find them," he told Petronius, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Find them before the emperor learns of this." As his engineer hurried away, Marcus remained in his seat, staring at the arena floor where fresh sand was being spread to cover the stains of violence. Around him, the crowd continued to roar its approval, but he could barely hear them over the sound of his own racing heart. Somewhere beneath his feet, in the maze of corridors he had created, desperate men were running for their lives. And Marcus Livius Aquila, architect of the Colosseum, found himself praying to gods he had half forgotten that they would find the freedom that his masterpiece had stolen from them. The games continued, but in the depths of the great amphitheater, a different kind of drama was unfolding. One that would test the limits of human courage and the price of imperial ambition. Chapter 7: The Weight of Stone. The oil lamp flickered in the evening breeze that crept through the narrow windows of Marcus Livius Aquila's villa, casting dancing shadows across the walls of his son's bedchamber. The boy lay motionless beneath a thin woolen blanket, his 7-year-old frame appearing impossibly fragile against the carved wooden bed frame. His breathing was shallow and labored, each exhalation a whispered struggle that seemed to echo in the silence of the modest home. Marcus knelt beside the bed, his calloused architect's hands hovering uncertainly over his son's fevered brow. The child's skin burned with an inner fire that no amount of cool water could quench, and his dark eyes, so like his mother's, stared unseeing at the painted ceiling above. For 3 days, the fever had raged through little Gaius's body, and for 3 days, Marcus had felt the crushing weight of absolute helplessness. "Has he taken any water?" Claudia's voice was barely a whisper as she entered the room, her arms laden with fresh linens and a clay bowl of barley broth. Her face, normally radiant with the quiet beauty that had first captured Marcus's heart, was drawn with exhaustion and fear. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, testament to the sleepless nights spent watching over their only child. Somewhere beneath his feet, in the maze of corridors he had created, desperate men were running for their lives. And Marcus Livius Aquila, architect of the Colosseum, found himself praying to gods he had half forgotten that they would find the freedom that his masterpiece had stolen from them. The games continued, but in the depths of the great amphitheater, a different kind of drama was unfolding, one that would test the limits of human courage and the price of imperial ambition. Chapter 7: The Weight of Stone. The oil lamp flickered in the evening breeze that crept through the narrow windows of Marcus Livius Aquila's villa, casting dancing shadows across the walls of his son's bedchamber. The boy lay motionless beneath a thin woolen blanket, his 7-year-old frame appearing impossibly fragile against the carved wooden bed frame. His breathing was shallow and labored, each exhalation a whispered struggle that seemed to echo in the silence of the modest home. Marcus knelt beside the bed, his calloused architect's hands hovering uncertainly over his son's fevered brow. The child's skin burned with an inner fire that no amount of cool water could quench, and his dark eyes, so like his mother's, stared unseeing at the painted ceiling above. For 3 days, the fever had raged through little Gaius's body, and for 3 days, Marcus had felt the crushing weight of absolute helplessness. "Has he taken any water?" Claudia's voice was barely a whisper as she entered the room, her arms laden with fresh linens and a clay bowl of barley broth. Her face, normally radiant with the quiet beauty that had first captured Marcus's heart, was drawn with exhaustion and fear. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, testament to the sleepless nights spent watching over their only child. "A little," Marcus replied, though his voice cracked with the lie. The boy had refused all sustenance, his cracked lips parting only for the occasional moan of delirium. "The physician will return tomorrow. He says the fever should break soon." Claudia set down her burden and moved to the opposite side of the bed, her fingers gently smoothing their son's damp hair. "He's so small," she murmured, and Marcus heard the tears she refused to shed. "When I carried him in my womb, I dreamed he would grow strong and tall, that he would see the wonders you were building and be proud of his father's work." The words struck Marcus like a physical blow. In his mind, he could still see young Gaius's face lighting up with excitement when he had first described the great amphitheater. The way the boy's eyes had widened with wonder at tales of engineering marvels and architectural triumphs. The child had begged to visit the construction site, to see the massive stones and clever machinery that his father had designed. "He will," Marcus said firmly, though his own faith wavered. "He will recover, and I will take him to see the Colosseum when he is well. I will show him every arch, every column, every hidden passage. He will understand what we built there." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus felt their hollowness. What did stone and mortar matter if this precious life flickered out like a candle in the wind? What glory was there in architectural immortality if those he loved most were lost to time's relentless march? The fevered dreams took hold again, and Gaius began to mutter incoherently, his small hands grasping at invisible phantoms. Marcus and Claudia took turns cooling his brow with damp cloths, speaking soft words of comfort that seemed to vanish into the shadows like smoke. The night stretched endlessly before them, punctuated only by the distant sounds of Rome settling into sleep, the clatter of late wagons on cobblestones, the call of night watchmen, the eternal whisper of the Tiber flowing toward the sea. As dawn approached and Claudia finally succumbed to exhaustion, curling up in the chair beside their son's bed, Marcus found himself unable to remain in the suffocating confines of the villa. The walls seemed to press in around him, each stone a reminder of all the grand structures he had built while his own family crumbled before his eyes. He needed air, needed space, needed to escape the sound of his child's labored breathing that seemed to count down the moments like a water clock measuring eternity. The streets of Rome were empty save for the occasional drunk stumbling home from the taverns and the early rising bakers beginning their daily labors. Marcus walked without conscious direction, his sandals echoing on the stone pavements that had been laid by other men's hands, other men's dreams. The city slumbered around him, its million souls unconscious of the private tragedy unfolding in one modest home on the Aventine Hill. He found himself at the gates of the Colosseum without remembering the journey, as if his feet had carried him there of their own accord. The massive structure loomed before him in the pre-dawn darkness, its travertine walls gleaming pale in the moonlight. No guards challenged him. Who would question the architect at his own creation? He passed through the corridors he had designed, climbed the stairs he had calculated, emerged into the arena that had witnessed so much blood and glory. The silence was profound, almost oppressive in its completeness. Without the roar of 50,000 voices, the space felt hollow, like a vast tomb waiting to be filled. Marcus walked to the center of the arena, where fresh sand covered the stains of yesterday's games. Above him, the Valerium's support structure created a web of shadows against the star-filled sky, and the empty seats stretched upward in perfect mathematical progression. This was his masterpiece, his bid for immortality. Every stone had been placed according to his calculations, every arch designed to bear the weight of ages. Long after his name was forgotten, long after his flesh had returned to dust, these walls would stand as testament to Roman engineering and imperial ambition. Tourists from distant lands would marvel at the precision of its construction. Scholars would study its innovations, and poets would sing of its grandeur. But tonight, standing in the shadow of his greatest achievement, Marcus felt only the crushing weight of mortality. Stone was eternal, but the hands that shaped it were fleeting. Architecture could outlive empires, but the architect's son might not live to see another sunrise. He remembered his boyhood dreams, the first time he had sketched a building on a wax tablet and felt the intoxicating rush of creation. Even then, he had imagined the structures that would bear his name, the monuments that would make him immortal. His father, the humble stonemason, had warned him that pride was a dangerous companion for a builder. "Stone remembers," the old man had said, "but it doesn't care who placed it there." Now, decades later, Marcus understood the truth of those words. The Colosseum would endure, but it would not mourn him when he was gone. It would not remember his sleepless nights calculating stress loads, his careful attention to every detail, his dreams of glory and recognition. It would simply stand, indifferent to the human cost of its creation. A sound disturbed the silence, a faint echo that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. For a moment, Marcus's heart clenched with fear, imagining the ghostly voices of all who had died in this place. But then he recognized it as merely the wind sighing through the complex passages of the hypogeum, the breath of the great structure settling into the cool night air. He walked to the edge of the arena and sat on a stone bench that had been carved from a single block of marble, its surface polished smooth by countless hands. Above him, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the struggles of mortal men. The constellation of Orion stood sentinel in the western sky, and Marcus remembered pointing it out to young Gaius on winter evenings, teaching him the stories of heroes and gods written in fire across the heavens. Would his son live to see those stars again? Would there be more evenings of shared wonder, more moments of a father passing knowledge to his child? Or would the fever claim that bright spirit, leaving only grief and the cold comfort of architectural immortality? Marcus closed his eyes and felt the weight of every stone in the Colosseum pressing down upon his shoulders. He had built a monument to human ambition, a temple to the glory of Rome, but he had also created a machine that fed on suffering and death. The escaped slaves, the dying gladiators, the terrified beasts torn from their native lands. All were part of the price demanded by his creation. In the distance, the first birds began their morning songs, and the sky lightened almost imperceptibly toward dawn. Soon the vendors would arrive to prepare for another day of games. The crowds would begin to gather, and the arena would fill once more with the sound of human voices crying for blood and spectacle. But for now, in the quiet hour before sunrise, Marcus sat alone with his monument and his mortality, feeling smaller than the humblest slave who had hauled stones for his vision. The Colosseum stood eternal around him, patient as death itself, waiting for the next act in the endless drama of human ambition and folly. And Marcus Livius Aquila, its architect and prisoner, gazed up at the fading stars through the arches he had designed, wondering if the gods would remember a man's love for his son when all his monuments had crumbled into dust. He walked to the edge of the arena and sat on a stone bench that had been carved from a single block of marble, its surface polished smooth by countless hands. Above him, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the struggles of mortal men. The constellation of Orion stood sentinel in the western sky, and Marcus remembered pointing it out to young Gaius on winter evenings, teaching him the stories of heroes and gods written in fire across the heavens. Would his son live to see those stars again? Would there be more evenings of shared wonder, more moments of a father passing knowledge to his child? Or would the fever claim that bright spirit, leaving only grief and the cold comfort of architectural immortality? Marcus closed his eyes and felt the weight of every stone in the Colosseum pressing down upon his shoulders. He had built a monument to human ambition, a temple to the glory of Rome, but he had also created a machine that fed on suffering and death. The escaped slaves, the dying gladiators, the terrified beasts torn from their native lands. All were part of the price demanded by his creation. In the distance, the first birds began their morning songs, and the sky lightened almost imperceptibly toward dawn. Soon the vendors would arrive to prepare for another day of games. The crowds would begin to gather, and the arena would fill once more with the sound of human voices crying for blood and spectacle. But for now, in the quiet hour before sunrise, Marcus sat alone with his monument and his mortality, feeling smaller than the humblest slave who had hauled stones for his vision. The Colosseum stood eternal around him, patient as death itself, waiting for the next act in the endless drama of human ambition and folly. And Marcus Livius Aquila, its architect and prisoner, gazed up at the fading stars through the arches he had designed, wondering if the gods would remember a man's love for his son when all his monuments had crumbled into dust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, new demonstrations of imperial power. But tonight, in the shadow of his greatest work, Marcus simply sat and prayed to whatever gods might listen that morning would find his child still breathing, still fighting, still alive in a world that seemed determined to devour everything tender and precious. The stone was eternal, but love was fragile. And for the first time in his life, Marcus understood which was more valuable. Chapter 8: The Emperor's Triumph. The golden light of midday Rome cascaded through the Valerium's silk canopy, casting the imperial box in warm amber as Emperor Titus Flavius Vespasianus settled into his ivory throne. Below him, the Colosseum's arena stretched like a canvas of sand and blood, while above, 50,000 voices merged into a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the amphitheater his father had envisioned. Caesar! 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 The chant rose from the plebeians in the upper tiers, cascaded down through the equestrian seats, and even found echo among the purple-striped togas of the senators in their reserved section. Titus raised his hand in acknowledgement, feeling the familiar weight of the laurel crown upon his brow and the heavier burden of imperial expectation upon his shoulders. The Vestal virgins sat in their place of honor to his left, their white robes pristine against the marble, their faces serene as they watched the spectacle below. Beside them, his advisors and prefects maintained the careful posture of men who understood that even their breathing might be scrutinized by the masses. Everything here was theater, not just the games, but his very presence, his every gesture calculated to project strength, generosity, and divine favor. In the arena's depths, gladiators emerged from the hypogeum like souls ascending from Hades. Titus watched as a Thracian fighter, broad-shouldered, scarred, moving with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to dance with death, stepped into the blazing sunlight. The crowd's roar intensified, and Titus felt a surge of pride swell within his chest. This was his father's vision made manifest, his own careful planning brought to fruition. The Flavian amphitheater stood as more than entertainment. It was a declaration to the world that Rome had emerged from the chaos of civil war stronger than ever. The scent of frankincense from the nearby shrine to Jupiter mixed with the earthier smells drifting up from below. Sweat, leather, the metallic tang of blood that would soon stain the sand. Titus breathed it in, this perfume of empire, and felt the pulse of Rome herself thrumming through the stone beneath his feet. "The people love you, Caesar," murmured Suetonius, his secretary, leaning close enough that his words wouldn't carry beyond the imperial box. "They sing your praises in the streets, speak of your generosity with the grain dole, your magnificence in these games." Titus nodded, but his attention remained fixed on the arena where the Thracian now faced a net-wielding Retiarius. Steel rang against steel, and the crowd swayed as one body, their collective gasp filling the air as the gladiator's blade found its mark. The Retiarius stumbled, crimson spreading across his arm, and Titus found himself leaning forward despite his imperial composure. Bread and circuses, he thought, recalling his father's pragmatic wisdom. Keep them fed and entertained, and they will follow you to the ends of the earth. Yet as he watched the wounded gladiator struggle to his feet, something twisted in Titus's chest, a sharp pang that had nothing to do with political calculation. The man below was perhaps 25, with the lean build of a former farmer or craftsman. His face, visible even from this height, bore the determined grimace of someone fighting not for glory but for one more day of life. How many such men had Titus sent to their deaths in Judea? How many villages had he razed? How many families scattered to the winds of empire? The gold and ivory adorning his box, the very marble beneath his feet, all of it built upon such suffering. The Thracian's sword found its mark. The Retiarius fell, his hand rising in the gesture of surrender, appealing to the crowd's mercy. 50,000 voices rose in judgment, a sound like the sea breaking against rocks. Thumbs turned, some up, some down. The eternal dance of life and death played out in the amphitheater's cruel democracy. Titus felt the weight of their expectation, the moment when imperial will would decide another man's fate. The crowd's eyes turned to him, and he saw in their faces the same hunger that had driven Rome to conquer the world, not just for land or gold, but for the intoxicating power to decide who lived and who died. He raised his thumb. The crowd erupted in approval, and the Thracian helped his fallen opponent to his feet. Mercy, but mercy granted at the emperor's pleasure. Mercy that reminded everyone present who held the power of life and death in Rome. As the afternoon wore on, Titus found his attention drifting from the spectacle below to the faces around him. The senators smiled and applauded, but he could read the careful calculation in their eyes, the way they gauged his reactions, stored away every gesture for future reference. The Vestal virgins maintained their sacred composure, but he caught glimpses of horror quickly suppressed when the violence grew too brutal. Even his own advisors shifted uncomfortably when a young gladiator, barely out of his teens, fell screaming to the sand. This is what it means to be Caesar, asterisk, he reflected. To smile while men die for your glory, to find joy in spectacle while souls are crushed for entertainment. The thought settled over him like a cloak of lead, and he found himself remembering his father's final words. An emperor must be all things to all people, Titus. But first, he must be Roman. When the sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the arena in shades of gold and crimson, Titus rose from his throne. The crowd's attention remained fixed on the final contest. A massive Germanic warrior against twin gladiators from Gaul, but several of his advisors noticed his movement. Caesar, Domitianus, his prefect, inquired quietly. "Continue the games," Titus said, his voice carrying the weight of imperial command. "I have matters to attend to." He made his way through the marble corridors behind the imperial box, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Here, away from the crowd's roar, he could think clearly. The passage opened onto a small chamber overlooking the city, where the noise of the games faded to a distant murmur. Suetonius followed, as Titus had known he would. The secretary's face bore the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to read his emperor's moods. "You have something to say?" Titus observed, not turning from the window where he watched the smoke from countless hearth fires rise over Rome's 7 hills. "The people are satisfied, Caesar. Your generosity today will be remembered, and tomorrow they will hunger for more spectacle, more blood, more bread." Titus's voice carried a weariness that would have shocked the cheering masses. "Tell me, Suetonius, how long can Rome sustain herself on entertainment alone?" The secretary hesitated, recognizing the dangerous territory of imperial philosophy. "Caesar, my father built this amphitheater to secure our dynasty, to prove that the Flavians could give Rome what she craved. But I find myself wondering if we have created a monster that will devour us all in the end." Titus turned from the window, and Suetonius saw something in his emperor's eyes that made him step back involuntarily. "I have been thinking of reforms," Titus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Not to the games themselves, the people would revolt, but to the treatment of gladiators, the conditions in the schools, perhaps limits on the frequency of capital punishment in the arena. Small mercies, carefully administered. Caesar, such changes would require delicate handling. The trainers, the sponsors, the crowd itself. I know." Titus's smile held no warmth. "Everything in Rome requires delicate handling. The question is whether we serve Rome or Rome serves us." The distant roar of the crowd swelled as another contest reached its climax. Titus listened to the sound, 50,000 voices raised in bloodlust and joy, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle upon his shoulders. "Return to the games," he commanded. "Ensure the crowd sees my banners, knows their emperor has not abandoned them. I will rejoin you shortly." As Suetonius departed, Titus remained in the chamber, looking out over the city that owned him as completely as he owned it. The Colosseum would outlast him, would outlast his dynasty, would stand as a monument to Roman power long after the empire itself had crumbled to dust. But the men who died in its sands, the slaves who built its walls, the architects who dreamed its soaring arches, they would be forgotten, their names lost to the hunger of history. He thought of Marcus Livius Aquila, the architect whose vision had given form to imperial ambition. The man who had built eternity from stone and mortar, who had created beauty from suffering, who had given Rome a jewel that would sparkle with blood for generations to come. The crowd's roar reached a crescendo, then began to fade as the day's final contest concluded. Titus straightened his shoulders, adjusted his laurel crown, and prepared to return to the imperial box. The games would continue, the people would cheer, and Rome would endure. That was the bargain he had made with destiny. His soul for the empire's stability, his peace for the nation's prosperity. As he walked back through the marble corridors, Titus cast one final glance toward the arena where the sand was being raked clean for tomorrow's spectacle. The Colosseum would open its gates again, would swallow more lives, would feed Rome's inexhaustible appetite for grandeur and violence. And he would sit in his ivory throne, smile at the crowd's adoration, and continue the eternal dance of emperor and empire, knowing that in the end, the stone would outlast them all. Chapter 9: Freedom and Chains. The sun hung low over the Colosseum's western wall, casting long shadows across the blood-stained sand where Lucius Varro knelt, his chest heaving with exhaustion and disbelief. The Germanic warrior who had faced him, a mountain of scarred flesh and braided hair, lay still beside him, his final breath having escaped with a whispered prayer to gods Lucius would never know. The crowd's roar had faded to an expectant hum, 50,000 voices waiting for the moment that would define the rest of his life. Maximus, the lanista who had owned him for 7 years, approached with measured steps, his face bearing the practiced solemnity of a man who had performed this ceremony countless times. In his weathered hands he carried the rudis, a simple wooden sword, unremarkable in its plainness, yet more precious than any treasure Caesar's legions had ever plundered. "Lucius Varro of Thrace," Maximus announced, his voice carrying across the arena despite the crowd's murmur. "You have fought with honor, displayed courage worthy of Rome herself, and earned through blood and skill what no man can take from you." He extended the wooden blade, its surface worn smooth by the hands of gladiators who had won their freedom before. "By the grace of Caesar and the will of the people, you are hereby granted the rudis. You are free." Lucius's scarred fingers closed around the weapon that was not a weapon, feeling its weight. So light compared to the bronze and iron that had been his companions for so many years, yet somehow heavier than any burden he had ever carried. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, chanting his name with the same fervor they had once used to demand his death. Varro! 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 The sound washed over him like a tide, and he felt tears he had not shed since childhood, streaming down his dust-caked cheeks. He thought of Gaius, the young Gallic prisoner who had died screaming in his second fight, of Marcus the Egyptian, who had taught him to read the movement of an opponent's eyes and had fallen to a lion's claws while the crowd laughed, of Helena, the female gladiator from Germania who had fought beside him in the naval battles, her courage greater than any man's, her body now feeding the fish in the Tiber. All of them deserved this moment, this wooden sword, this taste of freedom that came too late. "Rise, freeman," Maximus said, and Lucius obeyed, his legs unsteady not from exhaustion but from the weight of possibility. As he stood, the crowd's cheers reached a crescendo, and somewhere in the imperial box, he knew Caesar himself was watching, perhaps even approving of this display of Roman magnanimity. 3 days later, Lucius stood at the edge of the Subura, Rome's most crowded district, watching the river of humanity flow past him in the morning light. Merchants hawked their wares in voices that competed with the rattle of cartwheels on stone. Children darted between the legs of adults, their laughter bright against the constant din of the city. The air hung thick with the scent of baking bread, roasting meat, and the ever-present smell of too many people living too close together. He had awakened that morning in a rented room above a bakery, his body instinctively reaching for weapons that were no longer there. The rudis lay beside his pallet, its wood gleaming in the pale dawn light, a reminder that his war was over. But his scars told a different story, white lines across his arms where blades had found their mark, a permanent limp from a spear thrust that had nearly ended his career, and deeper wounds that no physician could heal. A woman jostled past him, her basket of vegetables balanced expertly on her hip, and she glanced at him with the casual indifference of someone who had never watched men die for sport. He envied her that blindness, that ability to move through the world without seeing death in every shadow, without hearing the echo of clashing steel in every raised voice. "You looking for work?" The voice belonged to a grizzled man in a leather apron, his arms blackened with soot from the forge. "Strong back like yours. I could use help with the anvil." Lucius looked down at his hands, hands that had gripped sword hilts and felt the life drain from opponents, hands that had killed more men than he could count. "I'm not sure I'm suited for that kind of work." The blacksmith shrugged. "Suit yourself. But a man's got to eat, rudis or no rudis." He gestured toward the wooden sword tucked into Lucius's belt. "Won't put bread on the table, that thing." As the man walked away, Lucius felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle upon his shoulders. In the arena, everything had been simple. Kill or be killed, fight or die, survive another day or join the ghosts that haunted his dreams. But here, in the world of free men, the rules were different, more complex, and he found himself adrift in possibilities he had never dared to imagine. He walked for hours through the city's twisting streets, past the forum where politicians and merchants conducted their business, past the baths where citizens gathered to gossip and relax, past the temples where prayers rose like smoke to gods who had either blessed or cursed him with survival. Everywhere he went, he felt the eyes of others upon him, some curious, some fearful, all of them recognizing something in his bearing that marked him as different, as other. A woman jostled past him, her basket of vegetables balanced expertly on her hip, and she glanced at him with the casual indifference of someone who had never watched men die for sport. He envied her that blindness, that ability to move through the world without seeing death in every shadow, without hearing the echo of clashing steel in every raised voice. "You looking for work?" The voice belonged to a grizzled man in a leather apron, his arms blackened with soot from the forge. "Strong back like yours. I could use help with the anvil." Lucius looked down at his hands. Hands that had gripped sword hilts and felt the life drain from opponents. Hands that had killed more men than he could count. "I'm not sure I'm suited for that kind of work." The blacksmith shrugged. "Suit yourself. But a man's got to eat, rudis or no rudis." He gestured toward the wooden sword tucked into Lucius's belt. "Won't put bread on the table, that thing." As the man walked away, Lucius felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settle upon his shoulders. In the arena, everything had been simple. Kill or be killed, fight or die, survive another day or join the ghosts that haunted his dreams. But here, in the world of free men, the rules were different, more complex, and he found himself adrift in possibilities he had never dared to imagine. He walked for hours through the city's twisting streets, past the forum where politicians and merchants conducted their business, past the baths where citizens gathered to gossip and relax, past the temples where prayers rose like smoke to gods who had either blessed or cursed him with survival. Everywhere he went, he felt the eyes of others upon him. Some curious, some fearful, all of them recognizing something in his bearing that marked him as different, as other. A group of young men passed him, their togas pristine and their conversation light with wine and philosophy. One of them pointed at Lucius and whispered something to his companions, and they all turned to stare. He caught fragments of their words. "The Thracian saw him fight, killed that Germanic giant." They spoke of him as if he were a creature from mythology, a thing of legend rather than flesh and blood, and he felt the familiar cage of fame closing around him once more. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Lucius found himself walking along the Via Appia, drawn by an impulse he couldn't name toward the massive structure that had defined his life for so many years. The Colosseum rose before him like a mountain of travertine and marble, its arches catching the golden light and throwing it back in brilliant reflections. From this distance, it looked almost benevolent, a monument to Roman engineering and artistic vision rather than a charnel house where dreams went to die. He positioned himself among the merchants and pilgrims who gathered near the amphitheater's base, selling souvenirs and trinkets to visitors who came to gawk at the marvel of the age. A Syrian trader offered him a miniature gladius carved from bone, and he shook his head, unable to explain that he had no desire to carry even a toy weapon ever again. The sounds began to reach him then, not the roar of the crowd, for the day's games had ended, but the echoes that seemed to live in the very stones themselves. He could hear Gaius's voice, young and frightened on his first day in the training pens. He could hear Helena's war cry as she charged into battle, her blonde hair streaming behind her like a banner. He could hear the wet sound of steel parting flesh, the gasping breath of dying men, the prayers spoken in a dozen languages to gods who had turned their faces away. His hand moved unconsciously to the rudis at his belt, and he found himself gripping it so tightly that his knuckles went white. This piece of wood was supposed to represent freedom, but as he stood there in the shadow of the Colosseum, he understood that true freedom was more complex than any ceremonial gesture could convey. A young boy approached him, perhaps 8 years old, his eyes wide with the kind of hero worship that had once made Lucius's heart soar. "Are you really him?" The Thracian thunder? My father says you killed 50 men in the arena. Lucius looked down at the child, seeing in his eager face all the innocence that the arena had stripped away from him. I am Lucius Varro, he said quietly, but I am no longer a gladiator. But you're free now, the boy said, as if freedom were a simple thing. A door that once opened could never be closed again. You can do whatever you want. Can I? Lucius thought, feeling the weight of memories like chains around his soul. Can any of us truly be free when we carry the dead with us wherever we go? The boy's father appeared, a merchant by his dress, and hurried his son away with apologetic nods toward Lucius. As they departed, the child's voice drifted back. When I grow up, I want to be a gladiator too. Lucius closed his eyes, feeling the familiar surge of sorrow and rage that had sustained him through so many battles. This was the legacy of the arena. Not just death and spectacle, but the poisoning of young minds with dreams of glory that came soaked in blood. How many more boys would die chasing the same phantom that had nearly destroyed him? The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the banners that had once fluttered above the imperial box. Somewhere in the city, Caesar was dining on delicacies from across the empire, surrounded by advisors and courtiers who had never felt the bite of a blade or the weight of another man's life in their hands. Somewhere else, Marcus Livius Aquila, the architect whose vision had created this monument to human suffering, was perhaps looking up at the stars and wondering what legacy he would leave behind. And here, in the shadow of the Colosseum, Lucius Varro gripped his rudis and felt the full weight of his freedom. Not the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, the terrible responsibility of deciding what to do with the life he had been given when so many others had been taken. The wooden sword in his hand was warm from his touch, its surface smooth and unremarkable. But it was his, earned through blood and pain and the deaths of men who had deserved better than to die for entertainment. It was a symbol of liberation, yes, but also of the chains that bound him to memory, to duty, to the ghosts who would walk beside him for the rest of his days. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Lucius made a silent vow to the dead who haunted his dreams. He would not waste the freedom they had died to give him. He would find a way to honor their sacrifice, to transform the violence that had shaped him into something that might serve life rather than death. The rudis was both his freedom and his burden, his liberation and his responsibility. The Colosseum loomed above him in the gathering darkness, its arches black against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow there would be new games, new deaths, new ghosts to join the chorus that sang in the stones. But tonight, Lucius Varro walked away from the arena as a free man, carrying with him the weight of all who had fallen and the hope that their sacrifice might yet find meaning in a world that had forgotten how to value life over spectacle. The wooden sword at his belt seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, a reminder that freedom was not a destination but a journey, not a gift but a choice that had to be made anew with each rising sun. And as he disappeared into the labyrinthine streets of Rome, he carried with him the echoes of eternity, the voices of the dead, the weight of the living, and the fragile promise of tomorrow. The Eternal Arena.
Rome, 1231 AD.
Brother Benedictus pulled his rough woolen hood closer against the morning chill as he approached the great ruin that dominated the eastern quarter of Rome. The dawn mist clung to the broken arches like the breath of ghosts and wildflowers. Purple lupins and yellow broom pushed through cracks in the travertine where once Caesar's banners had fluttered in imperial splendor. The Colosseum rose before him like a mountain carved by giants, its massive walls piercing the pale sky with a majesty that 6 centuries of neglect could not diminish. The monk paused at what had once been the grand entrance, running his weathered fingers along stones that bore the chisel marks of forgotten craftsmen. How many hands had shaped these blocks? How many slaves had labored under the Mediterranean sun to raise this monument to human pride? The questions haunted him as they had haunted countless pilgrims who came to this place seeking both wonder and redemption. He stepped through a gap in the outer wall, his sandaled feet silent on grass that had reclaimed the passages where once the Roman elite had strutted in their togas. Lizards darted between the stones, and somewhere in the upper galleries, a lark sang its morning song, oblivious to the weight of history that pressed down upon this sacred ground. The arena floor had long since collapsed, revealing the hypogeum beneath, that labyrinth of tunnels and chambers where gladiators had prepared for death, where wild beasts had paced in their cages, where the machinery of spectacle had churned with merciless efficiency. Now it was a garden of sorts, filled with wild herbs and flowering vines that softened the harsh edges of imperial ambition. Brother Benedictus knelt on the broken marble, his knees finding the same stones where emperors had once sat in judgment over life and death. He thought of Titus, whose coins still occasionally surfaced in Roman soil, bearing the proud inscription of the Flavian dynasty. He thought of the architect Marcus Livius Aquila, whose genius had shaped these soaring arches, and wondered if the man had ever imagined his creation would outlast the empire that built it. Most of all, he thought of the martyrs. The church taught that countless Christians had died here, fed to lions while crowds bayed for blood, their faith unwavering even as their bodies were torn apart. Whether the stories were true mattered less than what they represented: the triumph of the eternal over the temporal, of love over cruelty, of souls over spectacle. "Forgive them, Father," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that sighed through the empty arches. They knew not what they did. The prayer was for all of them: the emperors who had demanded blood, the architects who had enabled slaughter, the gladiators who had killed to survive, the crowds who had cheered for death. In this place where so much suffering had been transformed into entertainment, Brother Benedictus found not condemnation but compassion, not judgment but understanding of the human capacity for both evil and redemption. As the sun climbed higher, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber, he rose and continued his circuit of the arena. Birds nested in the upper galleries now, and he smiled at the thought that where once the roar of crowds had echoed, now only the gentle songs of creation filled the air. Even the stones themselves seemed to breathe with a peace that had been absent in the days of imperial glory. Brother Benedictus knelt on the broken marble, his knees finding the same stones where emperors had once sat in judgment over life and death. He thought of Titus, whose coins still occasionally surfaced in Roman soil, bearing the proud inscription of the Flavian dynasty. He thought of the architect Marcus Livius Aquila, whose genius had shaped these soaring arches, and wondered if the man had ever imagined his creation would outlast the empire that built it. Most of all, he thought of the martyrs. The church taught that countless Christians had died here, fed to lions while crowds bayed for blood, their faith unwavering even as their bodies were torn apart. Whether the stories were true mattered less than what they represented: the triumph of the eternal over the temporal, of love over cruelty, of souls over spectacle. "Forgive them, Father," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that sighed through the empty arches. They knew not what they did. The prayer was for all of them: the emperors who had demanded blood, the architects who had enabled slaughter, the gladiators who had killed to survive, the crowds who had cheered for death. In this place where so much suffering had been transformed into entertainment, Brother Benedictus found not condemnation but compassion, not judgment but understanding of the human capacity for both evil and redemption. As the sun climbed higher, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and amber, he rose and continued his circuit of the arena. Birds nested in the upper galleries now, and he smiled at the thought that where once the roar of crowds had echoed, now only the gentle songs of creation filled the air. Even the stones themselves seemed to breathe with a peace that had been absent in the days of imperial glory. The Colosseum had been many things since the fall of the emperors: a fortress for noble families who carved their names into its walls, a quarry for medieval builders who stripped away its marble facing to construct churches and palaces, a symbol of papal power when the popes sought to transform it into a shrine. a reminder of human folly when philosophers contemplated the rise and fall of civilizations. Yet through all its transformations, it endured. Earthquakes had shaken it, but it stood. Wars had raged around it, but it survived. Time itself had worn at its edges, but the essential structure remained, as if the vision of its creators had been built not just into stone and mortar, but into the very fabric of eternity. Brother Benedictus thought of the men whose stories had unfolded within these walls. Marcus with his architectural dreams and moral struggles, Lucius with his hard-won freedom and burden of survival, Kiso with his quiet resistance and desperate hope for escape. Their names were lost to history, but their spirits seemed to linger in the shadows, part of the great communion of souls that made this place sacred. The monk knew that centuries would pass, that empires would rise and fall, that Rome itself might crumble to dust. But the Colosseum would remain, bearing witness to the eternal human drama of ambition and suffering, of cruelty and compassion, of mortality and the yearning for something that transcends the grave. As he prepared to leave, Brother Benedictus knelt once more and placed his hand upon the ancient stone. The warmth of the sun had awakened something in the Travertin, and he could almost feel the pulse of all the lives that had touched this place. The emperors and slaves, the architects and gladiators, the martyrs and spectators, all of them united in the great mystery of existing. In the distance, the bells of Santa Maria Maggiore began to toll, calling the faithful to prayer, and Brother Benedictus knew it was time to return to the world of the living. But he would carry with him the silence of this place, the weight of its stories, and the profound truth that some things are too large for time to destroy. The Colosseum would outlast them all, would outlast the medieval world that now surrounded it, would outlast the Renaissance that would rediscover its glory, would outlast the modern age that would transform it into a symbol of human heritage. It would stand as a testament to the audacity of human ambition and the frailty of human flesh, a reminder that empires may fall but the human spirit, in all its contradictions and complexities, endures. As Brother Benedictus walked away, the morning light illuminated the great arches one final time, and somewhere in the breeze that whispered through the empty passages, the voices of the past seemed to murmur their eternal questions. What does it mean to be human? What legacy do we leave behind? How do we transform suffering into meaning, mortality into memory, the temporal into the eternal? The Colosseum stands silent, holding echoes of ambition, agony, and immortality within its broken walls.